In Memoriam is obviously an elegy. It's an elegy for Arthur Hallam, the close friend of Tennyson, who died in 1833 by a stroke in Vienna. As I mentioned in class on Tuesday, Hallam was among the brightest young minds at Cambridge when Tennyson was there. He really brought Tennyson out as a poet, supported him early on as a poet, encouraged Tennyson to write poetry at a time when maybe he would not have otherwise. He was an astute critic of Tennyson's poetry. Uttered the most important relationship of Tennyson's earliest years by far. And when he died, Tennyson not only lost a close friend, but also someone who had really helped to create his persona as a poet. So Hallam's death created not just deep sadness, but also deep doubt as to one, what kind of universe would lead to this sort of tragedy. This is probably a question that most people who are grieving ask: why did this happen? But also a very personal doubt of, oh, where's my biggest fan, to use our kind of language? Where's the person who believed in me the most? If he's not around to believe in me, can I believe in myself on my own? So the poem is an elegy, but it's a odd kind of elegy. It's a new kind of elegy for the time. In 1850, when the poem was published, most would have, in England, really throughout Europe, would have imagined that an elegy is a version of, say, John Milton's Lycidas or Percy Bysshe Shelley's Adonais. These are poems that mourn the death of a particular person. Edward King in the case of Milton's Lycidas, John Keats in the case of Shelley's Adonais. But the machinery of mourning is conventional. Instead of describing the person being mourned in particular detail, and instead of describing the mourner's emotions in particular detail, the poet fits the grief into preconceived patterns, often drawing from pastoral imagery from Greek and Roman mythology, for instance, often imagining a procession of mourners coming and mourning the poet, the dead person, in a very ritualistic sort of way. Ultimately, moving from the beginning of the poem, a place of grief and alienation from the person dead, to an acceptance of the sadness and ultimately an affirmation of the person's death and hope for a way forward. If you compare Lycidas and Adonais to In Memoriam, they feel quite artificial and clunky, you might say, as beautiful as they are, again, because they draw on these well-established conventions. They're very ritualistic, in other words. Now, by the time you get to In Memoriam here, it's highly personal. Arthur Hallam is talked about in some detail, but more the speaker's emotions and thoughts are explored in almost excruciatingly raw detail, especially for 1850, when still there was a sense that the poetic eye needed to be somewhat restrained, that one did not reveal everything. Of course, Tennyson isn't revealing everything, but it's a very raw poem for the time. And not only that, the poem doesn't seem to follow any set conventions at all. It doesn't seem to follow really much of a plan at all. It feels almost like a diary more so than a traditional elegy, a collection of poems that are loosely organized and centered upon one theme, the death of a beloved friend, but they don't necessarily proceed in a linear fashion at all. So if the poem as Elegy looks back to Adonais from the early 19th century, and if it looks back to Lycidas from the 17th century, it also looks ahead to the more open, vulnerable, raw, confessional poetry of the middle years of the 20th century. I'm thinking of John Berryman with his dream songs, or Robert Lowell with his life studies, or the poetry of Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton. So the poem is a hybrid, Tennyson's poem, in this regard. And what it does is it kind of brings the strengths of both ways of expression together. We do see, as we look through the poem, recurring themes, recurring images, recurring actions, which do give the poem a kind of unity and a ritualistic feel. Christmas occurs 3 times, for instance. The poet visits Arthur Hallam's door more than once, for instance. Yew tree shows up more than once, for instance. So there are these traditional symbols, a door as a possibility of a portal from life to death, from this world to the afterworld. Uh, Christmas as a time of light in the midst of darkness, and the yew tree traditionally growing in graveyards and seeming from one angle not to change at all and therefore to suggest death, but from another angle to grow ever so slightly with pollen on it, suggesting life. So there are these ritualistic moments again of Christmas, of visitation in the poem that ties it together. There are other images as well I'll talk about in another lecture. But at the same time, the poem feels random, unrestrained. It doesn't move in a linear fashion at all. There's extreme grief at the beginning, and then there seems to be some kind of peace, and there's extreme grief in the middle. In other words, there's no sense that the poet's getting better in a linear fashion. This isn't a person going through the so-called 5 stages of grief. Of course, as I may have mentioned in class, recent research has shown that whole theory of 5 stages of grief is quite erroneous. That there may be stages, but they don't occur in any set order, and they may occur all at the same time. Certainly, this poem is much more in line with that. That grief is irrational, unpredictable, and messy. And these little short bursts of song, these little sparrow flights of song. That's not, I'm going to get the line right. I don't. What does he call them? Well, I'm not finding it. Sparrow flights of song. Short swallow flights of song. Short swallow flights of song. So these are like short bursts of song that are very much based on particular moments, very concrete moments, as opposed to sort of a longer, more organized song, which traditional as we suggest. So this is one way to think about the structure of the poem. Again, it's this mix. So you have linearity and you have circularity. You have a sense of wholeness, but also a sense of fragmentation. There's a sense that there is aesthetic control in the poem, but also there's an immediacy in the poem, constantly kind of pushing against that control. So the best way to go through the poem is to go through it without looking too hard, I would say, for order, and think about it less as a polished piece. It is, and more of having the kind of impromptu, almost casual feel of a diary.